and a very warm welcome to all of you here at Conway Hall and those of you watching online. Thank you for joining us for this very special autumn keynote talk, which I think is as important to all of you as it is to us at the Stuart Hall Foundation. My name is Elaine Towdross and I'm chair of the foundation. The Stuart Hall Foundation was established in 2015 by Professor Stuart Hall's family, friends and colleagues to build on the important legacy of Stuart, one of our most important thinkers and public intellectuals. Since then, we've been committed to public education, addressing urgent questions of race and inequality in culture and society through talks and events, and building a growing network of Stuart Hall Foundation scholars and artists in residence, many of whom I'm delighted to say are here with us today. I'm truly honoured and delighted to be welcoming our distinguished guest, Arundhati Roy, who will be giving tonight's keynote address and who's travelled from her home in Delhi, especially to be with us this evening. As I'm sure many of you know, Arundhati is the author of two extraordinary novels, The God of Small Things, which won the Booker Prize in 1997, and The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize 2017. Both novels have been translated into more than 40 languages. My Seditious Heart, published in 2019, brings together essays written over a two-decade period when Arundhati devoted herself to the political essay as a way of opening up a space for justice, rights and freedoms in an increasingly hostile environment. Azadi, Fascism, Fiction and Freedom in the Time of the Virus, published in 2020, and in an expanded edition in 2022, collects the writing that followed and focuses on the meaning of freedom in a world of growing authoritarianism. Following her keynote talk, Arundhati will be in conversation with Farzana Khan. Farzana is a writer and cultural producer. She is the co-founder and executive director of Healing Justice London. Her practice works on building community health, rooted in disability justice and survival work, working towards collective liberation practice and structural justice. Farzana is the former creative and strategic director at Voices That Shake, bringing together young people, artists and campaigners to develop creative responses to social injustice. Following Arundhati's keynote and the conversation between Arundhati and Farzana, we shall be inviting questions from all of you before we close with a reading from Arundhati's Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Copies of that book and others signed by Arundhati, including her latest collection of essays, Azadi, Freedom, Fascism and Fiction, are available for purchase at the front desk. We are living in unprecedented times, with a global pandemic which has impacted tragically on communities across the globe, a climate catastrophe which is worsening daily in the face of government inaction, and the intensification of authoritarian practices across the globe, north and south alike. And yet we're increasingly encouraged by the media and politicians to consider our local situation as separate and distant from those of others elsewhere in the world. In a lecture she gave at the University of Texas earlier this year, Arundhati spoke about the criminalization of dissent in India and the branding of dissenters as intellectual terrorists with violent and devastating consequences. Witnessing the rapid suppression of any dissenting voices against the monarchy in Britain in recent weeks, justified by recent legislation curbing the rights to demonstrate, I was left wondering how long it would take for us to follow in India's footsteps, and how we are to make sense of the similarities and differences of the current conjuncture in which we now find ourselves, and what may come next. Who better to think through these than the wonderful Arundhati Roy. Thank you.
Thank you for that welcome. I actually wrote down what I wanted to say because I lost my mother just a few weeks ago, and I was frightened that I'd just blank out, standing in front of a big audience. So the lecture is called Things That Can and Cannot Be Said, the Dismantling of the World as We Know It. Thank you for inviting me to speak here today in memory of Stuart Hall. We've been trying to make this happen for what seems like years. I will never ever again take for granted the pleasure of being in a room together with so many fellow human beings. The pandemic has faded somewhat, but many of us are still struggling to get the measure of the trauma it has left in its wake. I can hardly believe that I never met Stuart, but reading his work makes me feel like we'd have spent a lot of time laughing together about things. The main title of this lecture, Things That Can and Cannot Be Said, is the title of a little book I wrote along with the actor John Cusack. It was about a trip that he and I made to Russia in December 2013 to meet Edward Snowden in Moscow. Our other companion was Daniel Ellsberg. For those of you who are too young to remember, he was the Snowden of his time, the whistleblower who made public the Pentagon Papers on the Vietnam War. Snowden, who warned us years ago that we were sleepwalking into a surveillance state, continues to live in exile in Moscow. And as we know, he was just given citizenship the other day. And we have tumbled enthusiastically into the surveillance state he warned us about, with our little phone companions that have become as intimate and as indispensable as any vital organ in our bodies, spying on us, recording and transmitting our most personal information so that we can be tracked, controlled, standardized, and domesticated, not just by the state, but by each other too. Imagine if your liver or your gallbladder didn't have your best interests at heart. Your doctor would tell you that you're terminally ill. That's the sort of bind we find ourselves in. We can't do without it, but it's doing us in. The first section of my talk will be about things that can and cannot be said, and the second about the dismantling of the world as we know it. This has been a bad year for those who have said and done things that cannot be said or done. In Iran, 22-year-old Mahsa Amina was killed while she was in custody of Iran's moral police for the sin of not wearing her headscarf in the way that is officially mandated. Meanwhile, in India, in the southern state of Karnataka, Muslim schoolgirls who wanted to assert their Muslim identity as Muslim women in their classroom by wearing hijabs were physically intimidated by right-wing Hindu men. This in a place where Hindus and Muslims have lived together for centuries, but have recently become dangerously polarized. Both instances, strict hijab in Iran and the prohibition of hijab in India and other countries, may appear to be antagonistic, but they aren't really. Forcing a woman into a hijab or forcing her out of one isn't about the hijab, it's about the coercion, robe her, disrobe her, the age-old preoccupation of controlling and policing women. In August, Salman Rushdie was savagely attacked in upstate New York by an Islamist zealot for his book, The Satanic Verses, a book that was first published in 1988. In 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini, leader of the Iranian Revolution and the first leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, issued an edict calling for Rushdie's death. All these years later, just when it had begun to seem that the anger and passions his book aroused had abated, and Rushdie gradually came out of hiding, came the attack. After the initial news of the 75-year-old Rushdie having survived the attack and being in good cheer, there's no news at all. One can only hope that he's recovering and will return to the world of literature with all his powers intact. Heads of state in Europe and the US have come out robustly in his support, some saying a little self-servingly, quote, His fight is our fight. Meanwhile, Julian Assange, who published and exposed some of the more terrible war crimes committed by soldiers of those countries, wars in which hundreds of thousands died, is in terrible health and remains locked up in Belmarsh prison, awaiting extradition to the US, where he may face a death sentence or several life sentences. So we must pause before casting this horrifying attack on Rushdie in cliched terms such as a clash of civilizations or democracy versus darkness, because millions have been killed in invasions led by these so-called free speech evangelists. And among those millions have been writers, poets, and artists too. As for the news from India, in June, Nupur Sharma, spokesperson of the BJP, India's ruling Hindu nationalist party, once a permanent bullying presence on TV talks, made several intemperate comments against Prophet Muhammad in a provocative performance whose very purpose appeared to be to cause offense. There was an international uproar, and several death threats later, she has retreated from public life. But 2 Hindu men who supported her comments were brutally beheaded. In the days that followed, throngs of Muslim zealots have gathered to chant, Tan se sar juda, separate the head from the body, and to call for a blasphemy law. They're not the only ones who conflate censorship and assassination. Earlier this month, I was in Bangalore to speak on the occasion of the 5th anniversary of the assassination of my friend Gauri Lankesh, the journalist who was shot down outside her home by Hindu fanatics. Hers was one in a series of assassinations that appear to be connected to the same shadowy group. Dr. Narendra Dabolkar, the physician and well-known rationalist thinker, was shot in 2013. Comrade Govind Pansare, a writer and member of the Communist Party of India, was shot in 2015. And the Kannada scholar, Professor M.M. Kalburgi, in August that same year. Assassination is, of course, not the only form of censorship we experience. In the year 2022, India ranks 150 out of 180 on the World Press Freedom Index, below Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar. We're policed not just by the government, but by mobs on the street, by social media trolls, and ironically by the media itself. On the hundreds of 24/7 TV news channels that we often refer to as Radio Rwanda, our baying TV anchors rage against Muslims and anti-nationals, call for dissenters to be arrested, sacked, and punished. They have ruined lives and reputations with absolute impunity and no accountability. Activists, poets, intellectuals, lawyers, and students are being arrested almost every day. As for Kashmir, the valley from which no news can come, it's a giant prison. Soon there could be more soldiers there than citizens. Every communication by Kashmiris, private as well as public, even the very rhythm of their breathing is supervised. In schools, under the guise of learning to love Gandhi, Muslim children are being taught to sing Hindu bhajans. When I think of Kashmir these days, for some reason, I think of how in some parts of the world, watermelons are being trained to grow in square molds so that they're cube-shaped and easier to stack. In the Kashmir Valley, it looks as though the Indian government is running that experiment on humans instead of melons at gunpoint. Down in the Gangetic Plains, the cow belt of North India, mobs of sword-wielding Hindus led by godmen, who the media for some reason calls seers, openly call for the genocide of Muslims and the rape of Muslim women. We have witnessed daylight lynchings and the genocidal killing of more than 1,000 Muslims. Non-government figures put that number at closer to 2,000 in Gujarat in 2002, and hundreds in Muzaffarnagar in Uttar Pradesh in 2013. Not surprisingly, both massacres took place just before crucial elections. We have watched the man under whose chief ministership the Gujarat massacre took place Narendra Modi, consolidate his position as Hindu Hriday Samrat, the emperor of Hindu hearts, and rise to assume the highest office in the country. He has never expressed regret or apologized for what happened. We have watched him continue to amass political capital from his dangerous, sneering anti-Muslim rhetoric. We have watched the highest court in the land absolve him of all responsibility, legal as well as moral. We have watched, nauseated, as leaders of the so-called free world embrace him as a statesman and a democrat. Last month, India celebrated the 75th anniversary of independence from British rule. From his elevated lectern in the Red Fort in Delhi, Modi thundered about his dream of empowering women in India. He spoke with passion, clenched his fist. He wore a turban flecked with the colors of the national flag. Empowering women in a society built on the Hindu caste system, where privileged caste men have for centuries exercised what they believe to be their ordained rights to the body of Dalit and Adivasi women, is not a matter of policy alone. It's about a socialization and a belief system. There is a rising graph of crimes against women in India, putting it on the map of amongst the most unsafe place for women. It surprises no one to see how often these days the criminals belong to or are related to members of the current ruling dispensation. In such cases, we have seen public rallies in support of rapists. In the most recent case, in which a 19-year-old girl was raped and murdered just a few days ago, a local RSS leader blamed her father for, quote, spreading raw milk before hungry cats. Even as Modi was delivering his Independence Day speech, the Bharatiya Janata Party government in the state of Gujarat announced special amnesty for 11 men who were serving life sentences for the 2002 gang rape of 19-year-old Bilkis Bano and the murder of 14 members of her family, including her mother, her sisters, her baby brothers, her aunts, her uncle, her cousin's one-day-old infant, and Saleha, Bilkis's 3-year-old daughter, whose head was smashed against a rock. This grisly crime, only one of several that was committed as part of the 2002 anti-Muslim Gujarat pogrom I mentioned earlier. The panel that approved their release had several members from the BJP, one of them an elected legislator, who went on record later to say that some of the convicts were Brahmins with good sanskar, good values, and it was unlikely they were guilty at all. In cases investigated by the Central Bureau of Investigation, as this one was, it is legally mandated that any decision to give convicts amnesty has to be approved by the central government, which is, of course, the government of Narendra Modi. So we must assume that this permission was given. When the convicts came out, they were greeted outside the prison walls as heroes. They were garlanded with flowers, fed sweets, and had their feet touched by members of Hindu groups loosely affiliated to the BJP. The looseness is to provide what is called plausible deniability, that make up the Sangh Parivar, the joint family. In a few months' time, Gujarat goes to the polls. In India, strange things happen just before our free and fair elections. It's always the most dangerous time. As the rapist mass murderers return to take their place as respected members of society, Teesta Setalvad, the activist whose organization, Citizens for Justice and Peace, has meticulously compiled documentary evidence to prove the complicity of the Gujarat government in general and Modi in particular with the 2002 massacre, was arrested, accused of forgery, tutoring witnesses, and attempting to keep the pot boiling. These are the conditions in which we live and work in India, and say the things that cannot be said. In speech, as in everything else, the law is applied selectively, depending on caste, religion, gender, and class. A Muslim cannot say what Hindus can. A Kashmiri cannot say what everyone else can. Solidarity, speaking up for others, is more important than ever, but that too has become a perilous activity. In India, as in other countries, the weaponization of identity, in which identity is disaggregated and atomized into micro-categories, that has turned the air itself into a sort of punitive heresy hunting machine. Even these micro-identities have developed a power hierarchy. In his book, Elite Capture, the philosopher Olufemi Taiwo describes how certain individuals then become elevated from these groups, individuals usually located in powerful countries, in big cities, in big universities, those with social capital on the internet, and they are then given platforms by foundations, by media, by corporations to speak for and decide on behalf of the rest of their communities what can and cannot be said, and by whom. It's an understandable response to historic pain and humiliation, but it's not a revolutionary response. Micro-elite capture cannot be the only answer to macro-elite capture. As some empirical research has shown, when we buy into a culture of proscription and censorship, it is the right that benefits disproportionately. A recent study by PEN America of banned school textbooks shows that the overwhelming majority of proscribed textbooks contain progressive texts on gender and race. Sealing in communities, reducing and flattening their identities into silos can be perilous and preclude solidarity. Ironically, that was and is the ultimate goal of the caste system in India. Divide a people into a hierarchy of unbreachable silos, and no one community will be able to feel the pain of another because they are in conflict constantly. It works like a self-operating, intricate, administrative surveillance machine in which society administers and surveils itself, and in the process ensures that the overarching structures of oppression remain in place. Everyone except those at the very top and the very bottom, and these categories are minutely graded too, is oppressed by someone and has someone to be oppressed by. Once this maze of tripwires has been laid, almost nobody can pass the test of purity and correctness. Certainly, almost nothing that was once thought of as good or great literature. Not Shakespeare for sure, not Tolstoy. Imagine presuming he could understand the mind of a woman called Anna Karenina. Not Dostoevsky, who only refers to older women as crones. By his standards, I'd qualify as a crone for sure, but I'd still like people to read him. It goes without saying that by these standards, every sacred book of every religion would not pass muster. Amidst the apparent noise in public discourse, we are swiftly approaching a sort of intellectual gridlock. Solidarity can never be pristine. It should be challenged, debated, argued about, corrected. By precluding it, we reinforce the very thing we claim to be fighting against. And now I'd like to turn to the subheading of my talk, this dismantling of the world as we knew it. I'd like to speak a little about queens and their funerals. When the Queen died, some British newspapers asked me to write a piece about her passing. I was a little puzzled by the request. Perhaps because I've never lived in England, Queen Elizabeth II barely existed even on the peripheries of my imagination. So I said, sure, but it won't be the Queen that you're thinking about. The Queen I was thinking about was my mother, who founded and ran a high school, who died earlier this month. For good or for bad, she was the most singular, most profound influence in my life. We were dangerous foes and desperately good friends. She was the obstacle race that I structured myself around from the time I was very young. And now that she's gone and left me not heartbroken, but heart smashed, my rather odd shape and structure doesn't seem to make sense to me anymore. I was tempted to make this lecture about the politics of two funerals, one on the world stage and the other in a small town in South India, but I will resist that temptation. So perhaps now's the time for me to say the first thing that should not be said, at least not here in London, not now. I couldn't believe the pomp and pageantry and the days of endless television coverage of the rites and rituals of her funeral. I was transfixed by the obsequious, reverential paying of respects by those darker folks who hold high office in her former colonies, now known as the Commonwealth. There was nothing common about that wealth. It was extractive and it flowed in one direction. We in the colonies paid for those costumes, those furs, those jewels, those gold scepters. There's much to say about colonies and colonialism and the monarchs who reigned over that barbarous period in history. Who better than Stuart Hall to tell us that story? But how's this? Just as a piece of graffiti as the somber cavalry rides past. The historian Mike Davis estimates that in the last quarter of the 19th century, between 30 and 60 million people died of hunger in the mostly man-made famines in colonial India, China, and Brazil. He calls it the Great Victorian Holocaust. Why do we love and admire those who humiliate us? That could be the most pertinent political as well as personal question of our times. I apologize if this sounds like an unnuanced commentary on colonialism. That's not my position. I don't count myself among those Indian intellectuals who rage against colonialism but choose to remain silent about the wrongs in our own societies. The Hindu caste system, for example, is one of the most brutal systems of social hierarchy the world has ever known. Many would call it a form of colonialism that predates British colonialism and is prevalent even today. Caste remains the engine that runs modern India. It's remarkable how many Indian writers and intellectuals manage to completely elide the question of caste, to unsee something that stares us in the face almost every moment of every single day. They have to assume the literary or academic version of a very elaborate, tortuous yoga asana. All this is the subject of much of my writing, so for now I'd like to return to my bemusement about the Queen's funeral. What was it really about? Someone please help me out here because I don't understand. It can't have been about the passing of a 96-year-old monarch of a small island country which is having trouble even holding on to the sum of its parts, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Was it only a harking back, a nostalgic invocation, a paean to the ghost of the empire on which the sun never set? Or was it something more than that? Was it about the past, or is it about the future? As the war in the Ukraine unfolds and the modern world as we know it comes apart at the seams, was all that pageantry actually a pantomime rally, a posturing, a parading of friends and allies for a battle that is still to come? It reminded me of the opening chapter of Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, about the lead up to the First World War. So, I'm quoting, "So gorgeous was the spectacle on the May morning of 1910 when 9 kings rode in the funeral of Edward VII of England, that the crowd, waiting in hushed and black-clad awe, could not keep back gasps of admiration. In scarlet and blue and green and purple, 3 by 3 the sovereigns rode through the palace gates with plumed helmets, gold braid, crimson sashes and jeweled sashes flashing in the sun. After them came 5 heirs apparent, 40 more imperial or royal highnesses, 7 queens, and a scattering of special ambassadors from uncrowned countries. Together they represented 70 nations in the greatest assemblage of royalty and rank ever gathered in one place, and of its kind, the last. The muffled tongue of the Big Ben tolled 9 by the clock as the cortege left the palace. But on history's clock it was sunset, and the sun of the old world was setting in a dying world of splendor, never to be seen again. The dangerous brinkmanship being played out in the Ukraine is being somewhat obscured by the noise of propaganda on both sides, but history's clock could very well be racing towards sunset. The various points of view on the war also involve some pretty tortuous yoga asanas, some pretty drastic seeing and unseeing, depending on where you have decided to place yourself. Many on the left cannot find it in themselves to call out Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. They believe that Ukrainian outrage against Russia has been entirely confected and cultivated by Western imperialism, that the Ukrainian famine of the early 1930s never happened. They deny that millions of Ukrainians, the historian Timothy Snyder estimates 5 million, died in the famine of the early 1930s under Stalin's policy of forced collectivization. They see Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a defensive war against an existential threat to itself by NATO. But that's not untrue. The fact that Russia does face a very serious threat is hard to deny. The hitch is that the defensive war is being fought offensively on Ukrainian soil and against the Ukrainian people. When the Cold War ended, demilitarization and nuclear disarmament should have begun. Instead, NATO did the opposite. It amassed more weapons, fought more wars, and used the territory of its allies and proxies for the aggressive and provocative forward deployment of troops and missiles. If Russia had done through proxies in Europe or the US what NATO is doing to it, there's little doubt we'd be seeing the moral arguments and Western media coverage turned inside out. None of this makes Vladimir Putin, a revolutionary anti-imperialist or a democrat of any kind. None of it alters the fact that he believes in an overtly fascist, anti-Semitic, anti-homosexual, Christian nationalist ideology, which ironically he calls denazification, propounded by his 2 favorite ideologues, Alexander Dugin and Alexander Prokhorov. His claim about Ukraine, Crimea, and Belarus being inseparable territories that make up ancient Rus, a theory based on the millennial myth of the Christian baptism of its leader Valdemar in Crimea in AD 988, has been correctly met with hilarity. But we must ask then, why is there less amusement in the same quarters when it comes to talk of Israel's treatment of Palestinians and its claims of being the ancient promised land for the Jewish people, which translates in modern legalese as, quote, the nation state of the Jewish people? Or in India, where the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, RSS, the Hindu nationalist militia and cultural guild of which Modi is a member, calls for Akhand Bharat, a sort of fantasy that is futuristic and ancient all at once, a future ancient India that includes Pakistan and Bangladesh, which will be conquered and where all its people will be subject to Hindu rule. Ordinary people in Europe are gearing up to face the harsh winter that is nearly upon them with very little or no heating, as Russia, in response to economic sanctions, threatens to shut off their gas supply. As Ukrainians fight on with relentless courage and the chances of a negotiated settlement fade away, anxiety is building over the possibility of the war expanding and escalating. Putin has announced the partial mobilization, whatever that means, of 300,000 military reservists. Perhaps for now, the US is far away enough and safe enough, but all of Europe, Russia, and much of Asia could become the theater of a war unlike any the world has ever seen, a war in which there cannot be a winner. Isn't it time for everybody to step back? Isn't it time to begin a real conversation about complete nuclear disarmament? God forbid Russia resorts to using US logic for turning to nuclear weapons. In an article titled, "If the Bomb Had Not Been Used," published in December 1946, Carl K. Compton, the physicist and former president of MIT, said that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had, quote, saved hundreds of thousands, perhaps several millions of lives, both American and Japanese, and that without its use, the war would have continued for many months. His logic was that the Japanese, even though they had been defeated, would not have surrendered. And if not for the atom bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of people, they would have fought to the last man standing. Was the use of the atomic bomb inhuman? Compton asks himself. All war is inhuman, was his reassuring reply to himself. It was published in The Atlantic. President Truman wrote in to endorse this argument. Years later, General William Westmoreland carried that logic a little further during the Vietnam War. Quote, "The Oriental doesn't put the same high price on his life as does a Westerner. Life is plentiful, life is cheap in the Orient. In other words, we Asians don't value our lives, and so we force the white world to bear the burden of genocide." And then there's Robert McNamara, of course, who had a successful career arc. First as the planner of the bombing of Tokyo in 1946, which killed more than 200,000 people. Then as the president of the Ford Motor Company. Next as the US Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, in which US soldiers were ordered to, quote, kill anything that moves, as a result of which 3 million Vietnamese lost their lives. And McNamara's last job was to take care of the world poverty as the president of the World Bank. Towards the end of his life, in an Errol Morris documentary called The Fog of War, he asks an anguished question: how much evil must we do in order to do good? As you must have gathered, I'm a collector of these gems. Let's not forget that President Obama had a kill list, and that Madeleine Albright, who President Joe Biden recently described as a force for goodness, grace, and decency, and for freedom. When she was asked about the estimated 500,000 Iraqi children dying because of US economic sanctions, famously said, "I think that's a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it." So where are we headed? Even those of us who stand squarely with the Ukrainian people against the Russian invasion of their country cannot help but marvel at the difference in tone and tenor of the Western media's coverage of the war in Ukraine and the breathless admiration with which it covered the US and NATO's invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. This January, Tony Blair, the most passionate purveyor of the fake news about Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction, and President George Bush Jr.'s most enthusiastic ally in the invasion, was ordered Knight Companion of the Most Noble Order of the Garter, the senior-most British order of chivalry. Following which I wrote a haiku poem which I've been advised not to read. So Watching the funeral of Queen Elizabeth the other day, I nearly choked on whatever it was I was drinking as I heard one of the bishops or archbishops say that unlike those who merely cling to wealth and power, Queen Elizabeth II would be loved and remembered for her life of service to the public. Her son, the new King of England, will inherit her wealth and station. His royal lifestyle will not be supported by his own private wealth, which reportedly amounts to about $1 billion. It will be paid for with public money by the British people, millions of whom, The Guardian reports, have begun to skip a meal a day just to keep the lights on. Perhaps it's hard for the rest of us to understand the mystery of British people's love and enthrallment with their monarchy. Perhaps it has to do with a national sense of identity and pride, which cannot and certainly ought not to be reduced to vulgar economics. But allow me to indulge in some vulgarity for a minute or two. A recent analysis in the Financial Times concludes that income inequality in the US and the UK is so great that they could be classed as poor societies with some very rich people. They're like us, third worlders now, banana republics, whose wealthy have seceded into outer space and whose poor are falling into the sea. A 2022 Oxfam study says that India's 98 richest people own the equivalent of the combined wealth of the poorest 552 million people. For this impertinence, Oxfam offices in India have been raided by the Income Tax Department and perhaps will soon be shut down, like Amnesty International and every other organization that is critical of the Modi regime. King Charles III, rich though he may be, is a pauper compared to Gautam Adani, the world's third richest man, Gujarati corporate tycoon and friend to Modi. Adani's fortune is estimated to be $137 billion, a sum that rapidly increased during the pandemic. In 2014, when he was first elected Prime Minister of India, Modi made a point of flying from Ahmedabad, his home city in Gujarat, to Delhi in Adani's private jet, his name and logo emblazoned across it. In the 8 years of Modi's rule, Adani's fortune has grown from $8 billion in 2014 to what it is now. That's an accumulation of $129 billion. I'm just saying, please don't read deep meaning into it. Adani's money comes from coal mining and operating seaports and airports. Most recently, he was involved in the hostile takeover of NDTV, the only mainstream national TV news channel that dares to delicately criticize the Modi regime. Most of the rest of the media is already bought and paid for. The corporations that are blasting mountain ranges, clear-felling forests, and bleaching coral reefs also fund happiness conferences, sporting events, film and literature festivals. They provide courageous writers platforms on which to condemn attacks on free speech and make declarations about their commitment to peace, justice, and human rights, and to say the things that can and cannot be said. Capitalism is in its endgame. Sadly, as it goes down, it's taking our planet with it. Between nuclear hawks and mining corporations, it's a race to the bottom. Meanwhile, for light entertainment, let's all fight about what gods to pray to, what flags to wave, what songs to sing. In case I've left you feeling dejected, let me read you an email I wrote in response to a member of the audience who criticized me gently for sounding overly optimistic when I spoke in memory of Gauri Lankesh. If we have no hope, let's all sit down and give up. There are millions of excellent reasons to be pessimistic. That's why I suggested we should divorce hope from reason. Hope should be wild, irrational, and unreasonable. In every line I write, every word I speak, what I'm really saying is, we're not zero. You haven't defeated us. For millions in the world with their backs to the wall, these debates about hope and despair are a luxury. Even here, underneath the reek of wealth in London, even a visitor can sense a sort of tense, vibrating unease, like the rumble between your feet as a train approaches the platform. None of this will matter, of course, in the event of nuclear war. that will simply end us. It's time for the two sides to step back and for the rest of the world to step in. Armageddon doesn't usually contain a clause for second chances. Thank you. Thank you.
I feel like we need to give you a second applause just so I can catch my breath. I want to begin with thanks and with gratitude. I've spent several weeks trying to prepare for this event so I could do justice to having you here and being with you. And all I can really say is the magnitude of what you've gifted us in the world, and your ability to take really dense and complex and nuanced matters and make space for it, for us to also hold with you. And I think that gift and skillfulness is also the skills we all need to be growing in ourselves. And in that magnitude and wealth and vastness of sitting and spending time with your texts and sacred texts as well, they feel sacred to me. And I feel you'll appreciate this more than my mind. In my body, 3 words I could just keep feeling. Courage, reckoning with understanding and heart. And across your fiction, across your essays, those were the things that kept coming up. And I think they also speak to what is needed in this moment. And I know you've said this to me before, that you don't like to be heralded as courageous, but when I'm speaking about courage, I'm also recognizing what you're asking and calling in from all of us, and courage in its etymology of with heart, to be able to sustain ourselves, to propel ourselves forward, because there are no, second chances in the Armageddon, as you said. Staying with the kind of map of what you just shared with us, of what first can't and cannot be said, in your book, which I recommend everyone gets a copy of, in Azadi, and in particular the chapter, The Graveyard Talks Back, you really explore fiction and also what it means to employ fiction or work with fiction when, as you give the example with Kashmiris, but so many of us, that you can't tell the truth because there isn't, that it's not being heard, that there's not space for it, that there's danger, that there's propaganda and such deep militarization of everyday life that there's no space for it. And so where you gesture towards in this is the use of fiction to be able to reckon, to understand on a personal level, but also on a collective level. And I want to read a short quote because I'd love to explore this with you. In this section you say, I'm not talking here of fiction as expose or as the writer of social wrongs, pardon the pun, nor do I mean fiction that is a disguised manifesto or is written to address a particular issue or subject. I mean fiction that attempts to recreate the universe of the familiar and then makes visible what the project of unseeing seeks to conceal. And I'd love for you to maybe explore with us how fiction in this time of mass propaganda, fake news, of onslaught of information that is heartbreaking, how do we work with fiction to know and understand?
Yeah, sometimes at the bottom of people's email, there's a quote from a talk that I did in 2002 after September 11th, which said, another world is not only possible, but she's on her way, and on a quiet day, when I listen very carefully, I can hear her breathing. And then I realized that actually it's not just that she's on her way, but has always been there, but it's a question of listening, you know, like taking the pulse of a place. So in particular, not in particular, but in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, it's basically set around graveyards that cover the wonderful valley of Kashmir, which is known as Jannat sometimes, which is paradise, and a guest house called Jannat Guest House in a graveyard in Old Delhi. And I didn't really think about this as some conceptual thing, and I realized it much after I had written the novel, that actually if you look at who lives there, who dies there, who's buried there, what prayers are said there, it's a revolution, you know. Because the people that come and get buried in that graveyard are people who do not fit into the precise mathematics of caste and class and religion in India, which is, although people think it's an anarchic place, it's actually a very precise, hierarchical, mathematical place where socially people belong, where in this grid in which they've been placed. And you suddenly realize that if you choose to look at how people actually breach those things, or how people survive in ways which are so imaginative in how they love. It's not just about, every person in every character in this book has a border running through them of gender, of caste, of something, and they are so subversive in their love for being able to do things that they are told they cannot do. And so I think what fiction helps me to do certainly is to pay attention to things that you're constantly distracted from. You're constantly told to look elsewhere or to think otherwise. And also, I find fiction in some ways the most radical form of writing, because you cannot, fiction cannot be about one thing. It has to be about how you understand this universe. So I don't think, and to me, the fiction that I write is important, that it can't be anything else. It can't be a movie, or it can't be a network, what is it called, Netflix thing, or it can't be a political essay, It can only be this. And then if it is only this, what is this? How far can you push this form? How experimental can you be with it? Without, a movie being the last station on the route, How can fiction be fiction itself?
Thank you. The next area I'd want to explore with you is actually, I had, after the passing of your mum, I had reached out to you to offer condolences, and you had replied back with a phrase that has just been living in my body since, and it really again spoke to what we're living, and the heart smash and the heartbreak and the things that we're seeing here in the UK, not just in terms of the cumulative and slow violence killing people, but also just the unbearable heartbreak that our communities are not surviving in terms of rates of suicide, and also that suicide being forms of dissent and protesting the state violence, and really you wrote back saying, to that grief and bereavement, it's a heart smash, but the fragments will rally. And I found, again, that sentiment of breaking and so much is coming undone, and it's the consequences of so many forms of oppression that we're living out that are coming undone, but also that are calling us to come together in all of the neoliberalized, all the ways that we're being fragmented. And I guess that brings me to the again, another piece that I wanted to kind of speak to, where you're calling us to come together, to find ways to be in solidarity, even if it is, as you said, not pristine, because that's the level of momentum and movement that is needed. So here you call us to action, you call us to rally, even in our fragments. You say, what we need are people who are prepared to be unpopular, who are prepared to put themselves in danger, who are prepared to tell the truth. Brave journalists can do that, and they have. Brave lawyers can do that, and they have. And artists, beautiful, brilliant, brave writers, poets, musicians, painters, and filmmakers can do that. That beauty is on our side, all of it. We have work to do and a world to win. So I really want to create space to explore rallying with you.
You know, you see, for example, what's happening. I think there are so many things that one doesn't know the answers to, but are very important to at least register and begin to think about. Because I've been thinking about how, you know, whether it was in Tahrir Square in Egypt, or whether it was what happened recently in Sri Lanka, you know, where people actually did come out on the streets, and they coordinated through the social media, and yet, you know, in Sri Lanka, they were literally inside the president's house, they were bathing in his swimming pool, they were resting on his bed, but those people have been arrested, and that president is coming back, you know. So what can people do, you know, and how do we do it? Because the minute you become visible, the kind of crushing weight of the state that comes down on people. So what is the subversion, or the, you know, sort of, it looks as if the only people that actually have a kind of revolutionary power are those who are now invisible, outside the range of their cell phones or whatever, you know, because this kind of surveillance and preempting and knowing, and the digital footprints that we leave, and this is something to really think about eventually, you know. How can you live outside of this? In England, it's insane, the level of surveillance, CCTV, through your phones, through everything, you know. I mean, that little book, that Things That Cannot Be Said, Snowden, you know, he just talks in full paragraphs about this subject, which is terrifying, because he was telling us how even if your computer is not connected to the internet, how it's possible for you to be recorded visually as well as audio. But so I do think, you know, that we have to take this upon ourselves now. What is this social media doing to us? What is good and what is bad about it? But I feel that I'm not on social media because I just feel that it keeps us busy all the time, from minute to minute to minute to minute to minute. You know, it does not allow you to think. Even if it's sort of making everyone's brain into a like and a dislike button, and you know, so and yet obviously we need it, but how do we organize around it or underneath it or whatever? There are groups that do it. Certainly in India, there are, you know, serious political groups that do it, and the people that are in jail many of them have had their phones, taken over by Pegasus and have had documents placed in their computers and so on. So, solidarity, first of all, it has to be built, but then how do you maintain it, and how do you act upon it? I think these are questions, and especially questions for a younger generation who hasn't known life without it, but a lot of us have. I mean, I was just thinking when I was studying architecture, and I had left home at the age of 18, and for 5 years I didn't use a telephone, I didn't sit in a car, and I never went into any person's house because I was living, somewhere. So you can't imagine a student studying architecture today, and I wasn't even these were just things that happened. It wasn't that I was purposely doing it. I would have loved to have gone into someone's house or sat in a car or made a phone call, but it was just not there. But there was somehow a world of so much imagination and innovation going on, because you're not continuously stimulated with information, even good information, bad information, whatever it is, I think we are in a really big bind at the moment, actually. I mean, I don't know what advice I have. It's like I'm not on social media, not out of some great moral feeling lofty or anything, but I just don't want to be busy all the time, I don't want to know what everyone is thinking all the time.
Thank you. Because we started a bit later, we now have to move into questions from the floor. So we're going to throw it wide open to you guys. I think there's a mic somewhere. If anyone wants to ask a question, just to raise your hands. We've got a question over here. Would you like to take a few questions together? Or not?
Yeah, let's see how.
Arundhati, I just want to say it was wonderful to hear you speak, and it was really illuminating and uplifting.
Thank you.
So a huge thank you.
Thank you.
In terms of what you just mentioned now, what you didn't mention, I wondered whether that was conscious or not, were things such as trade unions and women's organisations on an international spectrum, and whether that international trade union unity and that international feminism could be the beacon that takes us forward.
I think that's a complicated question, because often what happens in situations like that is a hierarchy develops, and people who have the resources and access don't understand what's going on very locally, So I think it has the even women's organizations, how complex is that subject now, So I think it's important to think together, but I would say that to expect there to be some single overarching international organization would actually be very troublesome. I think one has to respect things that are happening locally, because none of us can possibly understand the complexities and the uniqueness of things that go on. I mean, in India, if you're in Kerala, Delhi seems like abroad, So you don't speak the same language, you don't have the same. There are things that are similar, but there are things and contexts that are so different. So I think I remember, even when there was such, you remember that World Social Forum that used to happen. And I watched all the best activists just turn into travel agents, trying to organize things, and then it just all broke up because you're trying to do something which is pretty impossible, and because you have some theoretical idea in your head about some single overarching thing, whereas I don't know, in the fights, that much of what I write about is how can we accept diversity? How can we make room? We have to, it can never be one thing. There's never going to be one ideology or one religion or one anything that is going to rule this world.
Hi, thank you so much, Farzana and Arundhati. I would like to know, given that we are currently in the belly of the beast that is the empire, what do you see as the role of white people and whiteness in the dismantling of the world and our revolution?
See, once again, I think that things are so, white people obviously have a lot to answer for, and, that goes without saying. But I think that I really think that we should be cautious of making these unbreachable categories too, because it's not as though in our societies, where certainly, let's say in India, it's not that we don't have the equivalent of that kind of ancient hierarchy, ancient brutalization, and it's very easy for us to make these simple categories and then feel good about ourselves. But actually, things are complicated, and I feel that the problem is thinking hierarchically, and also, as I said in my lecture, there is so much dishonesty, because I know people in India who belong to privileged communities, privileged castes, privileged genders, who act like they're the most radical people on earth, calling for reparation, but say Kashmir and they'll be like, what? Whereas what they are doing there is, in terms of the way of thinking, no different. India, from the moment it became independent, there hasn't been a day when the Indian Army has not been deployed against, quote unquote, its own people. There has not been a day when it hasn't turned into a kind of imperial power itself, And so it's important to have these categories, but it's important to understand that that's not the only thing that's going on, And I think a lot of intellectual honesty is called for.
Thank you very much. Huge thanks to you for your work, for your talk today. I would say that I've always found the eloquence with which you are able to speak about oppression and injustice something very grounding. And I always find you to be very grounded in your practice of writing, of creating, of speaking. And my curiosity is probably slightly different, and I'm really wondering, in such a weighty practice, how do you nurture space for joy, for ease, for pleasure for yourself?
Look, I think that one of the biggest mistakes that we make is to assume that people who are fighting or resisting or where there's trouble are sad. That's absolutely not how it is, And we've had the most, like hilarious moments of my life have been when one is like deep inside it, you know. Like some years ago, I had gone into the jungles of central India where there's more or less a civil war being fought, and there's basically the government has signed off indigenous people's homelands to mining companies, and there's a Maoist guerrilla army in there, mostly composed of indigenous people, 40% of whom armed guerrillas are women. And you know, there's hundreds of thousands of paramilitary, and it's very brutal. And I went in there and spent 3 weeks walking with the comrades, as the essay was called. And late one night, I saw one of the comrades sitting under a rock under the stars, and he's like typing away on the computer. So I said, "What are you doing?" So he said, "I'm typing a denial, so a clarification." So I said, "What's the funniest clarification that you've ever issued?" So he said in Hindi, he said, "Ki nahi bhai sahab, humne gaay ko hathode se nahi mara," which means, "No, brother, we did not hammer the cows to death." And the story was that the chief minister, when he was campaigning for elections to become chief minister, he promised that there would be every indigenous person in the forest would be given a cow. Some of these villages are like many days' walk, you know, inside the forest. So when he became chief minister, he rounded up all these old cows, and then they were all given out to various contractors, and the contractors are supposed to take these cows into the forest and give them to people. And halfway through, they were like, "Fuck it," you know, like, who's gonna go? So they would just release them and come back and say, you know, these Maoists, they killed the cows, and, you know, like that way the Maoists got a bad name. Then they also anti-Hindu because they are killing cows and so on. So the poor Maoists are in the forest saying, "Nahi bhai sab, humne nahi mara." And he said if we had to like publish all our denials and clarifications, we'd have like 10 volumes of, you know, books on the shelf. But I'm just saying, you know, that's why I say, you know, I constantly get questioned about this hope and despair thing, and I'm like, people are not sitting around asking themselves, am I hopeful, am I despair? They don't have a choice, you know. And so these are things which again, I don't know, I mean, I'm saying this too often, I think, that we don't have these separate feelings of hope and joy and peace and resistance. They're all one bloody thing, you know, like that's the life, that's my life, that's how I am. And I don't do anything that makes me unhappy. I do things, I'm not a Gandhian. I don't believe in voluntary suffering and all that. So, you know, it's just one's, I mean, I could spend a lot of time talking about Gandhi, by the way.
We've got questions, space for about 2 or 3 more questions, so maybe we could take 2 together.
Sure.
And one over there.
Thank you for sharing about your mother and the quality of your relationship. It sounds beautiful. My question is...
It wasn't beautiful.
Dynamic. Growth.
It was interesting.
My question is...
where are you? I can't see you.
I'm here.
Ah, okay, yeah, good.
Arundhati. I just wanted to know, what should we do about caste to support and show solidarity to challenge the caste system?
Well, I think you just have to, you know, it's it's more complex than, you know, apartheid in South Africa or something, but it's as present. So I think the first thing is to be aware of it and understand it. You know, it's not, you need to understand it, and that would be, I think, important, because what has happened is that because people think of it as some sort of exotic oriental thing with Gandhi and yoga and all that, and they have, it has flown under the radar of international approbation, and that, I think, has allowed something. I mean, I'm not saying that people here can do anything about it, but I'm just saying it's important to be aware of it, because as I said, you know, it's extraordinary to me how much academic and artistic and intellectual work can manage to elide something like that, which is at the center of society, which is the engine that runs modern India, you know. So I would say read about it, understand it. For example, in this collection of my essays called The Seditious Heart, one of the essays is called The Doctor and the Saint, and it's about Gandhi and his debates with Dr. Ambedkar, who was actually one of Gandhi's intellectual opponents, who Richard Attenborough didn't even mention in his movie, for example. But Gandhi's views on caste, on race, on gender do need to be interrogated very, very seriously, you know. And it's a great pity that people don't know about. I mean, I don't want to make him into a villain or anything, but he was a complex man, a very effective politician. There were things about him which were visionary, but there were also things about him which were unbelievable, you know. And how can you just erase those things from history and construct a completely artificial character? But if, you know, to understand how complicated his relationship was with race, his views on race came from being grounded in caste, you know. So, yeah.
Hiya, can you hear? Having recently quit art school, I thought a lot about my experience there, and
where are you?
I'm up here.
Okay, I got these interrogation lights on. Can't see you. Anyway, yeah, I can't see you, but it doesn't matter.
And on your right?
Okay.
Just there, just there.
Right.
Okay, I definitely can't see there. It's right. Lights in my... Okay.
And the huge emphasis they place on art schools on explaining, rationalizing, contextualizing just about anything you do, whether that be a gesture, a color, a dot, a word. And so it's quite interesting. And obviously, some things are done intentionally and are made explicit, but I think a lot of things are also expressed more subconsciously or implicitly. So I was quite interested in your work and how you use both stories and non-fiction to express certain beliefs or values. And it'd be interesting to hear about particularly your process of writing fiction and how your values and beliefs enter into that. And perhaps what's the value of telling a story versus writing an essay and vice versa.
I didn't...
correct me if I'm wrong, but the kind of exploring what's the value of writing, to understand your process around fiction and creating, but also around the value of writing an essay or and fiction.
Yeah, and just you clearly have beliefs and values and principles, and how does that enter into your fiction? So
I would say that for when I write fiction, I do not. It's almost like whatever those are so distilled in you that you don't separate them. I mean, for one of the characters, for example, in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, is a intelligence officer called his name is Biplab Dasgupta, and he's called, for reasons you'll know when you read the book, he's called Garson Hobart. And his values are perhaps almost diametrically opposed to mine. But to me it was important that he wasn't easy meat, you know. So it almost drove me crazy because he's my intellectual equal, but on the other side. So you're almost defeating yourself while you're writing Garson Hobart, you know. And so in fiction, obviously, you know, you're the writer, so at some point you're in control, but there's a process of letting it go and then, you know, reeling it in again. It's complicated, but I don't believe that any writer, however bad, whether they're writing fiction, fairy tales, poems, whatever they're writing, you cannot escape the glare of literature. Like, the writer's values, politics, beliefs cannot be hidden away. It's impossible, you know, which is why you think that every fairy tale is political, you know. And if I understood you correctly, you're asking me what's the difference between why I choose to write fiction and non-fiction, is that right?
Yeah.
So for me, actually the non-fiction, it just, you know, I never thought that I would ever be that person who wrote sort of 20 years of essays, non-fiction essays, because it started out when The God of Small Things came out, and when, you know, I won the Booker Prize, and you know, I was this was just around the time that, you know, the India had opened its markets, and it was sort of taking its place on the world stage, and I was more or less paraded as one of these, you know, international stars, and I was at the high table. And then suddenly this right-wing government came and did a series of nuclear tests which unleashed a kind of new language, a public language of nationalism and ugliness, and I wrote the first essay, which was called The End of Imagination, which quickly kicked me off the pedestal of this, you know, whatever. And that led to, you know, these interventions in a world that was changing so rapidly, and there was the media also changed, you know, from suddenly it became privatized, it became corporatized, it became so completely committed to the corporate project. And they were, you know, the most perilous thing to be in India today is a good journalist, because you're just not going to have a job. There's no way, you know. So those of us who do have a foot in the door, who do command a space, you know, it was almost like this, you know, trying to break this bullying consensus that led to this. So the non-fiction, if you look at it, often it's an intervention in a pretty urgent way about something that's closing in, or people that are being closed in on, and the fiction, you know, takes years. I'm never in a hurry, as you can tell.
Thank you everyone for your questions and also for your responses. I think here we're going to park questions, because in a few moments we'll get to hear a reading from Arundhati, so it's a very great segue.
Yes, okay. So I'm going to just read, sorry, yeah.
So please would you join me in saying an enormous thank you to Arundhati Roy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please keep your seats because we're going to have an opportunity to hear Arundhati read from the Ministry of Utmost Happiness. But bear with me while I say a few words. Before Stuart Hall died, he identified something which he called a civilizational struggle, Arundhati, between radical democracy, which opens up a space for multiple identities and experiences, and authoritarian regimes on the other side that close down difference. I think today you've done what you do so eloquently in your fiction and in your essays, which are entangled, deeply entangled, of alerting us to the importance of feeling the pain of others and occupying the space of others, and saying the things that cannot be said wherever we are. Thank you so much to you for coming all this way to be with us this evening. It's been a real honour and pleasure. Thank you, Farzana, for your skillful questions and orchestration of the audience questions. Thank you to all those who made this event possible, the brilliant Stuart Hall Foundation team, Harriet, Ilse and Orsod, the Stuart Hall Foundation trustees and associates, Holly and the Conway Hall team for hosting us, Penguin Random House, Peter Fraser's Dunlop, who are Arundhati's publishing agent, David Godwin Associates, also Arundhati's publishing agent, Caro Communications, all the brilliant assistants who helped us tonight, Taib, Kerry Luke and Meha, Nehum Books and Vivian, and all our funders and regular donors. And thank you to all of you who've attended in person and virtually. I'm going to take a leaf out of Arundhati's book and turn to the vulgar question of economics. We're called a foundation, but we're a tiny organisation with a very small team. We've been running now for 7 years with the support of many of you here. This has enabled us to develop a network of 64 scholars who are continuing Stuart's legacy. We've supported artists through our annual Stuart Library residency in partnership with Innova. We've commissioned artworks from artists like Elaine Michener and Trevor Matheson. We've developed a public programme which is vibrant digital resources filled with conversations committed to articulating and understanding the times we live in. And it's thanks to you that we've survived the pandemic. We've got some really exciting plans for 2023 and beyond. But in order to carry on supporting artists, scholars and activists for another 7 years at least, we need your support. So you'll find the leaflet on your chairs. Those of you online, you can do this online too through our website. We've launched tonight a Friends scheme. And by pledging at least £10 a month, you'll be directly contributing to our work and helping us produce a broader, more accessible and far-reaching programme. So please join us imagining and building a more just future. And Arundhati, we have to hear the haiku at some point. Arundhati Roy.
So it's just going to be short. So this is just an account of when one of the main characters, who's called Anjum, she actually lives in a place in Old Delhi which is called the Khwabgah, which means in Urdu the house of dreams, with a whole lot of people of various genders, and she gets caught up in the Gujarat massacre and then escapes. And then the trauma of that makes her unable to live in the Khwabga anymore, and she moves out into a nearby graveyard where her fathers and her parents have been buried, and many of the people that she knows. So on her first night in the graveyard, after a quick reconnaissance, Anjum placed her Godrej cupboard and her few belongings near Mulakat Ali's grave, that's her father, and unrolled her carpet and bedding between Ahlam Baji's and Begum Renata Mumtaz Madam's graves. Not surprisingly, she didn't sleep. Not that anyone in the graveyard troubled her. No jinns arrived to make her acquaintance. No ghosts threatened her haunting. The smack addicts at the northern end of the graveyard, shadows just a deeper shade of night, huddled on knolls of hospital waste in a sea of old bandages and used syringes, and didn't seem to notice her at all. On the southern side, clots of homeless people sat around fires, cooking their meager, smoky meals. Stray dogs in better health than the humans sat at a polite distance, waiting politely for scraps. In that setting, Anjum would ordinarily have been in some danger, but her desolation protected her. Unleashed at last from social protocol, it rose up around her in all its majesty, a fort with ramparts, turrets, hidden dungeons, and a wall that hummed like an approaching mob. She rattled through its gilded chambers like a fugitive absconding from herself. She tried to dismiss the cortege of saffron men with saffron smiles who pursued her with infants impaled on their saffron tridents, but they would not be dismissed. She tried to shut the door on Zakir Mia, lying neatly folded in the middle of the street, but he followed her, folded through closed doors on his flying carpet. She tried to forget the way he had looked at her just before the light went out of his eyes, but he wouldn't let her. She tried to tell him that she had fought back bravely as they hauled her off his lifeless body, but she knew very well that she hadn't. She tried to unknow what they had done to all the others, how they had folded the men and unfolded the women, and how eventually they had pulled them apart, limb from limb, and set them on fire. But she knew very well that she knew. They who, Newton's army, deployed to deliver an equal and opposite reaction. This was one of the things that was said about what happened in Gujarat, that this was, punishment, collective punishment to Muslims for the burning of a train in which 69 Hindus had been burned to death. But, who burnt the train and who was to pay the price, there was no connection. 30,000 saffron parakeets with steel talons and bloodied beaks, all squawking together, Musalman ka ek hi stan, Kabristan ya Pakistan. Only one place for the Musalman, the graveyard of Pakistan. Anjum, feigning death, had lain sprawled over Zakir Mia's body, counterfeit corpse. But the parakeets, even though they were or pretended to be pure vegetarian, this was the minimum qualification for conscription, tested the breeds with the fastidiousness and proficiency of bloodhounds. And of course they found her. 30,000 voices chimed together, mimicking Ustad Kulsumbi's Birbal, that is a parakeet that used to belong to the Ustad, the guru of Khwabga. I, hi, Sali, Randi, Hijra, sister fucking whore Hijra, sister fucking Muslim whore Hijra. Another voice rose high and anxious, another bird, nahi yaar, mat maro, Hijron ko marna ab shagun hota hai. Don't kill her, brother. Killing Hijras brings bad luck. So Hijras is the Urdu word for a range of people, but trans women, and intersex people. Bad luck, nothing scared those murderers more than bad luck. After all, it was to ward off bad luck that the fingers that gripped the slashing swords and flashing daggers were studded with lucky stones embedded in thick gold rings. It was to ward off bad luck that the wrists wielding iron rods that bludgeoned people to death were festooned with red puja threads lovingly tied by adoring mothers. Having taken all these precautions, what would be the point of willfully courting bad luck? So they stood over her and made her chant their slogans, Bharat Mata Ki Jai, Vande Mataram. She did, weeping, shaking, humiliated beyond her worst nightmare. Victory to Mother India, salute the mother. They left her alive, unkilled, unhurt, neither folded nor unfolded. She alone, so that they might be blessed with good fortune. Butcher's luck, that's all she was. And the longer she lived, the more good luck she brought them. She tried to unknow that little detail as she rattled through her private fort. But she failed. She knew very well that she knew very well that she knew very well. The chief minister with cold eyes and a vermilion forehead would go on to win the next elections. Even after the government fell at the center, he won election after election in Gujarat. Some people believed he ought to be held responsible for mass murder, but his voters called him Gujarat Ka Lalla, Gujarat's beloved. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again, Arundhati Roy and Farzana Khan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.